The boardroom went silent when Chairwoman Priscilla Voss slid Dr. Desmond Archer's file across the table and called the black surgeon unqualified. Desmond had rebuilt their failing cardiac program, trained half the department, and saved patients other doctors had refused to touch. Still, security waited outside. His badge was already disabled, and the board expected him to leave publicly humiliated. Desmond closed the folder, stood and said nothing. Then one chair scraped backward. Another followed. Before Priscilla could finish her accusation, 11 respected surgeons removed their badges, crossed the room, and walked out beside the man she had tried to erase. Stay until the final operation, where one hidden report proves why 11 surgeons risked everything to defend Dr. Desmond Archer. Inside operating room number 6 at Harbor Crest Medical Center, Desmond Archer stood over a 61-year-old man whose aorta had been torn in 2 places, a case so dangerous that 2 other hospitals in the region had already turned him away. The room was tense, monitors chirping nurses, exchanging quick glances, but Desmond's hands never wavered. Midway through the procedure, he found a second tear that no scan had detected, and instead of freezing, he calmly changed course, calling for a backup bypass line before anyone else in the room had fully registered the danger. The patient survived. When the younger residents praised him afterward, Desmond deflected every word of it, insisting that the team had saved the man, not him alone. A small moment that revealed exactly the kind of leader. He was nothing like the arrogant figure the Prospal hospital board would later try to invent. The patient's wife had waited outside for nearly 6 hours, pacing the same stretch of hallway until her legs ached, and when Desmond finally stepped out of the operating room, still in his scrubs, he did not deliver the news with the quote, clinical distance. Some surgeons favored kneeling instead beside her chair, so they were at eye level before telling her that her husband had made it through. It was a small gesture, one that cost him nothing but a few extra seconds. Yet it was the kind of detail the nursing staff would later describe again and again when asked what made Desmond Archer different from other surgeons they had worked beside over the years. In the quiet after the surgery, Celeste Merritt, the head of general surgery, reminded Desmond of where the cardiac program had stood 3 years earlier, back when Harbor Crest carried the worst complication rate of any hospital in the region. Desmond had been brought in to fix what seemed unfixable, and in less than 2 years, he had cut post-operative complications nearly in half, built an emergency response protocol from scratch, retrained the entire surgical team, and helped the hospital reclaim its lost accreditation. For over a year, not a single preventable death had occurred under his watch, a record no other surgeon at Harbor Crest could match, and one that made him indispensable to a hospital now chasing something far larger than patient outcomes. That something was a robotic surgical system called the Aurelius X9, the centerpiece of a $480 million merger between Harbor Crest and a corporation called North Star Health. The machine was scheduled for a lavish public unveiling, and Desmond was asked to sign a document certifying that the system had passed every required safety test. Instead, he found records showing the robotic arm had locked around simulated arteries during 3 separate trial runs, failures that had quietly been reclassified as operator error rather than equipment malfunction. An engineer privately warned him that under sustained heat, the device's control processor could lose responsiveness for up to 14 seconds. And in a human heart, 14 seconds was the difference between survival and death. Desmond refused to sign. When Priscilla Voss learned that Desmond was standing in the way of the launch, she studied his name on the file for a long moment before speaking in a voice as cold as it was final, telling her assistant they would simply find another surgeon, and making certain that Desmond Archer no longer had the standing to interfere. Desmond requested full access to the Aurelius X9 testing data, but the technology department handed him only a sanitized version 1, where all 3 serious malfunctions had vanished from the record entirely. He went looking for Jonah Whitcomb, the hospital's compliance director, and found a man who was visibly rattled, someone who eventually admitted he had once seen a 47-page report from the manufacturer warning that the fursibly gripping arm could lock during extended operation. That report had disappeared from the hospital's internal archive shortly after a private meeting between Priscilla Rowland Keene and a representative from the manufacturer, and Jonah had never found the courage to say so out loud until now. Rather than accusing anyone outright, Desmond proposed a 2-week delay for an independent safety inspection, a reasonable compromise that any responsible institution would have welcomed. Rowland Keene, the hospital's chief executive, refused immediately, knowing that any delay risked giving North Star an opening to walk away from the merger entirely. During the next executive meeting, Priscilla peppered Desmond with questions designed to chip away at his credibility, rather than address the safety concerns, asking whether he held direct certification from the manufacturer, how many procedures he had personally completed on the new system, and whether his objections were really about safety or about being replaced by newer technology. Desmond answered every question without raising his voice, explaining that no certification mattered more than verified safety data, and that his concern was never about opposing progress, but about refusing to deploy an unproven device on living patients. Celeste sat through the meeting without speaking, but she noticed something troubling: the way Priscilla repeatedly cut Desmond off mid-sentence, while allowing every other surgeon in the room to finish their thoughts freely. Afterward, she warned Desmond privately that the board was quietly assembling a file to justify his suspension, and he told her that losing his position frightened him far less than the thought of an adult patient's family being told after the fact that the hospital had known about the risk all along. When Human Resources failed to find any legitimate violation in Desmond's record, Priscilla redirected their focus to a single administrative detail: an expired robotic surgery certification listed in the electronic system. In reality, Desmond had completed the renewal course 6 months earlier, but the update had simply never been entered into the official file, an oversight that suddenly became the foundation of an entire case against him. Jonah later discovered that the confirmation email verifying Desmond's renewed certification had been moved into a restricted folder under a direct order issued from the executive office itself, evidence that the missing certification was no accident but a deliberate omission. Desmond soon received formal notice that he was required to appear before the board for a special competency review. And unlike previous evaluations of this kind, this one was not conducted privately. Priscilla had invited media contacts, investors, and several department heads to attend, and when Desmond read the guest list, he understood immediately that this was no longer an evaluation at all, but a public execution of his reputation, carefully staged in advance. The night before the hearing, Desmond sat alone in his office, reviewing years of surgical outcomes, patient charts, and complication reports. Not to defend himself, but because old habits of preparation had never left him, even when the evidence, being weighed against him, had nothing to do with medicine at all. Celeste stopped by unannounced, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Neither of them would finish, and told him plainly that whatever happened the next morning, several people in that room already knew the truth and were simply too afraid of losing their own positions to say it aloud. Desmond did not ask her to speak up on his behalf, understanding that courage could not be demanded from another person, only offered freely or withheld. And he spent the rest of the evening organizing his own documentation, certain that facts, however inconvenient, were the only defense he intended to bring into that room. The large conference room was packed when the hearing began. 2 security officers stationed just outside the doors, and Desmond's hospital badge had already been deactivated before the proceedings even started. Priscilla opened by declaring that the hospital had a responsibility to protect patients from surgeons who could not keep pace with modern technology. And though she avoided saying his name, at first everyone in the room understood exactly who she meant. One by one, she presented a series of distorted claims that his robotic certification had lapsed, that he had never completed a single procedure on the new system, that he had once abandoned a robotic surgery midway through to switch to an open procedure, and that he routinely defied administrative decisions and had refused to certify the new program's safety. Desmond calmly explained that the abandoned procedure she referenced had actually been a trial run where the device's sensors stopped responding mid-operation, and that switching methods in that moment was precisely what had saved patient's life. Priscilla did not let him finish, instead playing an edited video clip designed to make him look panicked and out of control. Inside the operating room, though Celeste immediately recognized that the opening seconds, the moment the equipment had thrown its own error, warning had been cut entirely from the footage. Priscilla slid the file across the table and delivered the line that would echo through every hallway of the hospital in the days to come, declaring in front of the entire room that Harbor Crest could not entrust patient lives to a surgeon who was unqualified to operate in modern medicine. The room fell into a heavy silence, and Desmond could see in the faces around him that many people knew the accusation was false, yet not one of them was willing to lift their head and say so. He did not raise his voice or lash out in anger, choosing instead to open the file, calmly point directly to the missing certification record, and ask to see the original documentation, a request Priscilla dismissed by claiming the hearing already had sufficient evidence. Moments later, the board voted to suspend him immediately, and Desmond removed his own badge, set it on the table, and turned to leave, believing for a moment that Priscilla had won. Celeste was the first to rise from her chair. She announced that the video had been deliberately edited and that the entire hearing had violated basic professional standards, then removed her own department head badge and placed it beside Desmond's before crossing the room to stand at his side. Thaddeus Wynne stood next, followed almost immediately by Marlowe Sutton, and one chair after another began scraping backward across the floor as the room seemed to shift beneath Priscilla's feet. Sterling Knox rose, then Colette Ramsey, then Everett Baines, Landon Greer, Yvette Monroe, Franklin Pruitt, Odessa Grant, and finally Gideon Frost, each one removing their administrative credentials and setting them down without a word. Together, the 11 surgeons declared that they would take no part in the Aurelius X9 program, that they were resigning from every administrative post they held, that they would finish their responsibilities to current patients out of duty rather than obligation, and that they would not accept any new elective procedures until an independent investigation had taken place, refusing to let a colleague be discarded over nothing more than an honest safety. Warning. Priscilla ordered security to seal the doors, but Celeste looked her directly in the eye and told her that she could take away their titles, though she could never force them to call a lie the new standard of medical care. Together, the 11 surgeons walked out of that boardroom beside Desmond Archer, passing rows of stunned staff and a scattering of cameras that had until that moment only been there to celebrate a merger. Footage of 11 surgeons walking out together spread quickly through professional circles. But Priscilla moved fast to control the narrative, with an official statement accusing Desmond of inciting a mass walkout, disrupting hospital operations, and standing in the way of medical progress, with one particularly cruel article suggesting he was exploiting racial politics to cover up his own shortcomings. Desmond refused to answer with anger, offering only a single measured response that asked the hospital to release the full testing data and let the truth speak for itself. Priscilla scrambled to recruit replacement surgeons from other hospitals, but many candidates quietly withdrew once they learned that the hospital's most respected surgical team had unanimously opposed the robotic program. Elective surgeries were postponed. Adult patients began requesting transfers. Major donors started asking pointed questions, and North Star warned that it would walk away from the merger entirely if the Aurelius X9 program did not launch on schedule. Under mounting pressure, Roland pushed Priscilla to promote a far less experienced surgeon into the role of program director. A consultant named Conrad Pike, who held the manufacturer's certification but had never handled a complex aortic case inside Harbor Crest's own walls. Inside the executive suite, Roland grew increasingly desperate, pacing between calls from North Star's lawyers and messages from board members demanding answers he did not have. He blamed Desmond for the collapse in public confidence, insisting to anyone who would listen that a single stubborn surgeon had turned a routine technology upgrade into a public relations disaster, conveniently leaving out the buried report that had started the entire chain of events. Priscilla, for her part, began quietly reaching out to former colleagues at other institutions, testing whether the damage to her own name could still be contained if the story were framed correctly before it spread any further, unaware that Jonah was already documenting every one of her calls through the compliance office's own internal logs. Meanwhile, Desmond and the 11 surgeons gathered in a rented conference room where Desmond made clear that he never wanted any of them to sacrifice their careers on his behalf. Celeste told him plainly that they had not walked out for friendship, but because if the board could fabricate one surgeon's record so easily, any physician in that hospital could someday be pressured into signing off on something dangerous. Together they agreed on a shared set of principles: that they would not attack Priscilla personally in public, that patient privacy would remain protected at all times, that only lawfully obtained evidence would be used, that the matter would be formally reported to the State Medical Licensing Board, and that none of them would return to Harbor Crest until an independent inspection had taken place, while still remaining ready to respond if any patient's life was ever in immediate danger. Jonah reached out to Desmond in secret, revealing that he had located a backup copy of the system's access logs records that proved Roland's own office had deleted Desmond's certification from the file exactly one day before the hearing began. The 47-page technical report, however, remained missing, and Jonah suspected a physical copy might still exist inside a restricted equipment archive that only Priscilla and Roland could access. Before that lead could be pursued any further, Bernadette Wexler, a longtime hospital donor, was rushed into the emergency department with severe chest pain, and imaging revealed that a complex aneurysm in her aorta had begun leaking blood into the surrounding tissue, meaning she would need surgery that very night. When Conrad Pike walked into her room to introduce himself as her new surgeon, Bernadette looked past him and asked a single question that would set the next chapter of the story in motion, wanting to know exactly where Dr. Archer was. Bernadette had once donated $35 million to help build Harbor Crest's cardiac center, and she understood Desmond's abilities intimately, having been under his care for several years already. When Priscilla arrived to explain that Desmond had been suspended for incompetence, Bernadette calmly asked to see the official suspension order, along with the professional evidence behind it. And when Priscilla could not produce a complete set of documents, Bernadette refused to sign consent for Conrad Pike to operate on her. Her condition continued to worsen by the hour, and transferring her to another hospital carried its own extreme risk, since the aneurysm could rupture completely during transport. Roland pushed for an emergency legal order to force the surgery forward with Conrad Pike alone, but Celeste reminded everyone present that Bernadette remained fully conscious, entirely capable of making her own medical decisions, and legally entitled to refuse any physician she did not trust. Bernadette had built her fortune from nothing, starting a small textile business decades earlier, before growing it into a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and she had never once in her long career allowed another person to make a decision for her that she was still capable of making herself. Lying in a hospital bed, with tubes running into her arm, she still managed to summon the same steady authority that had once negotiated deals across 3 continents, telling Priscilla in a low, even voice that she had survived far more dangerous rooms than this one, and that she would not be rushed into trusting a stranger simply because the hospital found it convenient. Priscilla left the room without the signature she had come for, and for the first time since the ordeal began, she looked less like a woman in control and more like one running out of options. Desmond received a direct call from Bernadette, and she did not ask him to return out of loyalty, only wanting an honest answer about whether Conrad was truly capable of performing the surgery. Reviewing her scans remotely, Desmond told her the truth that Conrad was a competent surgeon, but that her specific arterial structure was poorly suited to a robotic approach, and that an open procedure would be considerably safer. Priscilla still wanted the Aurelius X9 used first, believing that a successful debut on a well-known donor would generate powerful publicity right before the merger closed. Conrad found himself under enormous pressure to comply, and although he had entered the case with confidence, closer study of her scans left him quietly uneasy about the risks involved. Priscilla warned him that backing out would end his working relationship with Northstar entirely, leaving him caught between his own judgment and the demands of the people who controlled his career. Meanwhile, Jonah slipped into the restricted equipment archive using emergency access credentials, and inside an old audit box, he finally found the missing 47-page technical report alongside the minutes from a secret meeting. Those minutes proved that Priscilla and Roland had been warned about the robotic arm's locking failure 3 full months earlier, with the manufacturer explicitly recommending that the control processor be replaced before the device was used on any patient. Replacing it, however, would have delayed the public launch by at least 6 weeks, a delay the board had refused to accept, and beside Priscilla's own signature was a chilling handwritten note stating that they would proceed on schedule and manage the risk through internal communications. As Jonah photographed the documents and prepared to leave, he heard hospital security approaching down the corridor, and at that very moment, Bernadette suddenly lost consciousness as her aneurysm began to fully rupture, leaving Harbor Crest only minutes to decide how to respond. And Priscilla immediately ordered the surgical team to proceed with the Aurelius X9. Bernadette was rushed into surgery in critical condition, and though Conrad requested an open procedure, Roland insisted the robotic system was already prepared, and that switching approaches now would cost them precious time they did not have. Conrad was forced to begin the operation using the robotic arm, and when Celeste learned what was happening, she immediately called Desmond and the other 9 surgeons, all 11 of them rushing back to the hospital, only to find their badges still locked. Rather than force their way in or create a scene, Celeste invoked an emergency staffing provision that allowed suspended privileges to be temporarily restored whenever the hospital lacked sufficiently qualified personnel for a life-threatening case. But Priscilla refused to sign the authorization. Inside the operating room, the Aurelius X9 functioned normally for the first several minutes, allowing Conrad to reach the damaged section of the artery. But the control processor's temperature began climbing steadily as the procedure continued. The tissue clamping arm grew sluggish in its response, and Conrad requested an immediate switch to an open procedure. But Roland, watching from the control room, ordered him to continue for a few more minutes, rather than let the program's very first case end in what would look like failure. Conrad objected, but before he could push further, a system error flashed across the display, and the clamping arm locked rigidly in place, directly against the leaking section of the artery, causing Bernadette to begin losing blood at an alarming rate. The surgical team lacked the specific experience needed to safely disengage a locked robotic arm under these conditions, and Conrad finally demanded that someone call Desmond. Priscilla still refused, arguing that bringing a suspended surgeon into an active operating room would expose the hospital to serious legal liability. But Jonah burst into the surgical wing, clutching the report he had just recovered, revealing publicly that Desmond's certification had been deliberately erased and that his suspension had been built entirely on falsified documentation. Celeste argued that this made the suspension legally void from the start, and Conrad, as the physician of record, formally requested Desmond's assistance as an emergency consult. Priscilla threatened to fire anyone who let him through the doors, and Gideon Frost answered her without hesitation, telling her she could fire all of them once the patient was still alive to see it happen. All 11 surgeons signed the emergency privilege request together, transforming what had once been personal loyalty into a unified professional judgment that no administrator could easily override. Somewhere behind the scenes, a junior administrator quietly leaked word of the standoff to the hospital's own legal counsel, who arrived within minutes and warned Priscilla in blunt terms that refusing an emergency privilege request signed by 11 senior surgeons in a case where a patient's life was actively at risk exposed the hospital to liability far greater than anything Desmond's presence could create. Priscilla's authority, built for months on carefully managed narratives and controlled meetings, had no answer for a room full of people who no longer needed her permission to do what they knew was right. And for the first time since the ordeal began, she stepped back and said nothing at all. Desmond walked back into the hospital past 2 silent rows of staff who had gathered to watch, offering no glance toward Priscilla, no argument, and no demand for an apology, asking only how much blood the patient had already lost. Once inside the operating room, Desmond assessed the situation within seconds, calling for the robotic system to be shut down entirely, the chest to be opened manually, and a bypass circuit established immediately. The clamping arm remained locked against the tissue, and releasing it too quickly risked tearing the artery apart completely. Desmond assigned specific roles to each of the 11 surgeons standing around him. The same physicians who had once walked out of a boardroom beside him now gathered around an operating table, ready to prove through action exactly why they had trusted him in the first place. And as the monitors suddenly blared a warning, Bernadette's blood pressure dropped to a level that could barely sustain her. Desmond organized the team into 3 coordinated groups, Thaddeus controlling blood flow through the aorta, Celeste widening the surgical access point, and Colette and Landon preparing a graft to replace the damaged section of vessel, while Sterling monitored the risk of oxygen deprivation to the Pruslish. Brain and Gideon coordinated emergency blood transfusion, with the remaining surgeons managing tissue damage and preparing contingency plans in case anything else went wrong. Conrad admitted openly that he had let administrative pressure override his own surgical judgment, and Desmond did not use the moment to condemn him, instead keeping him in the room, because he understood the robotic mechanism better than anyone else. Present a small decision that revealed Desmond was not seeking revenge, only the survival of his patient. Releasing the locked arm required cutting its power and manually disengaging the mechanism, but the moment the tissue lost its mechanical support, there was a real risk the artery would tear open completely. Desmond demanded absolute precision from every person in the room, each surgeon executing their assigned task within a matter of seconds. And when the mechanism finally released, the artery did tear, flooding the surgical field with blood, as Bernadette's heartbeat vanished from the monitor for several agonizing seconds. Desmond did not panic quickly, locating the point of rupture, controlling it by hand, and ordering the bypass circuit to begin immediately. Celeste sutured the surrounding tissue, while Thaddeus positioned the graft, and as Sterling reported falling blood flow to the brain, Desmond faced an impossible choice between finishing the graft or restoring circulation immediately. He turned to a temporary blood rerouting technique he had developed years earlier on his own, a method the manufacturer had never included in the Aurelius X9 program because it depended entirely on human skill rather than the robotic system. After several unbearable minutes, the graft was secured, and Bernadette's heart began beating on its own again, though a small secondary tear appeared near the original clamp site. A complication Desmond handed to Conrad to repair under his direct guidance, giving him a chance to correct his own mistake, rather than simply pushing him aside. Throughout those final hours, no one in the room spoke, unless it served the patient directly, the usual chatter of a long operation, replaced by a silence that felt almost reverent, as though everyone present understood they were witnessing something larger than a single procedure. Nurses who had worked alongside Desmond for years later said they had never seen him move with such total stillness. Every motion economical, every instruction clear. No wasted breath spent on anything but the woman on the table in front of him. When the final suture was placed, and the monitors settled into a steady, even rhythm, several of the 11 surgeons standing around that table allowed themselves for just a moment to breathe again. The surgery stretched on for several more hours before Bernadette's blood pressure finally stabilized, with no signs of neurological damage saved in the end by the very open surgical approach Desmond had recommended from the beginning. Outside the operating room, Jonah handed his recovered report to an investigator from the State Medical Licensing Board with a second copy, sent directly to North Star's internal audit committee. And although Priscilla tried desperately to reclaim the documents, it was already far too late. When Desmond finally emerged from surgery, she attempted one last time to accuse him of violating his suspension, and Celeste standing beside him answered simply that he had just repaired the consequences of her own decision. State medical investigators launched an emergency inquiry sealing the Aurelius X9 system and seizing every relevant email access log and board meeting record they could find. The recovered 47-page report proved that the manufacturer had warned of the processor failure, that Priscilla and Roland had known the risks in advance, that the board chose to proceed anyway out of fear of losing the merger, that 3 testing failures had been deliberately misclassified, that Desmond's certification had been intentionally deleted, that the hearing video had been selectively edited, and that the entire competency review had been designed from the start as a media strategy rather than a genuine evaluation, since no independent professional review had ever actually taken place. Investigators interviewed each of the 11 surgeons separately, and though none of them had coordinated their answers in advance, every account matched each one, describing Desmond as the only surgeon who had insisted on proper equipment testing before it was ever used on a living patient. Conrad also testified that Roland had personally pressured him to keep operating with the robotic system, even after he requested to switch to an open procedure, corroborating everything the 11 surgeons had already said. North Star suspended the merger entirely and demanded the return of funds already advanced, and several board members quickly distanced themselves from Priscilla in an effort to protect their own positions. Reporters who had once covered the walkout as a story about a single defiant surgeon now scrambled to understand the far larger picture unfolding around them, requesting interviews with anyone connected to the case, though Desmond declined. Nearly every one of them, preferring instead to let the official investigation speak on its own terms rather than turn a matter of patient safety into a spectacle. Legal analysts began speculating about potential criminal liability for the falsified records, while patient advocacy groups across the state pointed to Harborcrest as a warning about what could happen when corporate incentives were allowed to override medical judgment. Even physicians at unrelated hospitals began reviewing their own equipment certification records, more carefully unsettled by how easily a respected surgeon's credentials had been erased by someone with the right level of access. The wrong set of priorities. Priscilla held a press conference insisting she had simply followed expert advice, but Jonah released the meeting minutes, bearing her own signature, including her chilling note about managing risk through internal communications, a single sentence that became the clearest proof yet that she had valued the hospital's public image far more than the lives entrusted to its care. Bernadette woke from surgery, and upon learning everything that had happened, insisted that neither her name nor her donations be used to shield the board from accountability, confirming publicly that Desmond had recommended the safer approach from the very beginning. When the board convened again, Priscilla found herself on the other side of the questioning for the first time, and though Desmond attended at their request, he did not seek her public humiliation, asking only for the full truth to be disclosed, for retaliated staff to have their records restored, and for an independent safety committee to be established going forward. Priscilla tried one final time to convince him that exposing everything completely could bring the entire hospital down, and Desmond answered that a hospital saved by lies was never really a hospital at all, only a business wearing a white coat, a line that effectively ended the conversation as the board voted to remove her from the chair before a second vote could even begin, with Roland submitting his resignation before that vote ever took place. Once Priscilla and Roland had departed, the interim board restored full professional privileges to Desmond and all 11 surgeons, offering Desmond the position of chief medical officer, along with a higher salary, a private office, and complete authority over the surgical program. Desmond recognized immediately that the board was still trying to use him as a public relations symbol to repair its damaged reputation, and he refused to sign anything right away, instead presenting 6 conditions of his own. He demanded the creation of an independent safety committee with the power to veto any dangerous equipment, a full protection from retaliation for any staff member who reported wrongdoing, mandatory independent auditing of complication data, voting representation for nurses and technicians, a system that made it impossible to alter professional records without a visible trail, and a public apology to himself and every employee who had been threatened throughout the ordeal. Several board members argued the conditions were far too strict, insisting that no chief medical officer in the hospital's history had ever been granted this level of structural oversight, and that granting it now would set a precedent no future administration could easily unwind. Desmond listened patiently to every objection, then reminded the room without raising his voice that the previous structure had allowed a known equipment failure to be hidden from the very surgeons whose hands were on the patients, and that no title or salary was worth returning to a system built the same way it had been before. When it became clear the board still hesitated, Desmond prepared to walk away for a second time, but once again the 11 surgeons rose behind him, recreating the very moment from that first hearing, and declaring they would only return in full once every condition was accepted. Bernadette announced that her future donations depended entirely on genuine reform, and several other major donors quickly echoed her position, leaving the board with no realistic choice but to accept every demand Desmond had made. He then made one final unexpected request, insisting that Conrad Pike not be dismissed, reasoning that Conrad had accepted responsibility, testified honestly, and helped save Bernadette's life, and that punishing someone who had already admitted his mistake would only teach everyone else to keep hiding theirs instead. Conrad remained on staff required to complete an independent professional review, and released entirely from any obligation to the equipment manufacturer that had once controlled so much of his judgment. Jonah was appointed director of a newly created office protecting whistleblowers, while Celeste remained head of general surgery now, with the explicit authority to reject any administrative decision that endangered patients. The other 9 surgeons returned fully to their previous departments, each of them carrying a quiet, unspoken understanding that their standing inside Harbor Crest would never again depend solely on the goodwill of whoever happened to sit at the head of the boardroom table. During an official press conference, hospital leadership formally withdrew every accusation ever made against Desmond, confirming that his certification had never actually lapsed, and that the earlier review had relied entirely on falsified records. Standing at the podium that day was a very different set of executives than the ones who had once orchestrated his suspension. Several of them visibly uncomfortable reading a statement that amounted to a public admission of institutional failure, yet none of them argued for softer language, understanding that the surgeons and the community watching them had earned nothing less than the plain, unvarnished truth. When a reporter asked how it felt to finally be vindicated, Desmond answered that this had never been a victory for him alone, because if the 11 surgeons beside him had chosen silence, instead the truth might have stayed buried forever, and turning toward them he said simply that they had not walked out because he was incapable of defending himself, but because a broken system only changes when the people inside it refuse to keep obeying what they know is wrong. 3 months later, Harbor Crest operated under an entirely new leadership structure, and the Aurelius X9 program remained suspended until the manufacturer replaced the faulty processor and completed a fully independent inspection. Rather than collapsing as Priscilla had once warned it, would the hospital saw patient trust grow steadily, largely because it had chosen to openly acknowledge its failures and follow through on genuine reform. Bernadette recovered fully and personally attended the opening of a new facility called the Desmond Archer Surgical Safety Center, and although Desmond had resisted having his name attached to it, Bernadette reminded him that the honor was never meant to celebrate a perfect man, only to remember a surgeon who had once refused to sign his name to a lie. Inside the same conference room, where Desmond had once been called Unqualified, the 11 surgeons gathered together again, the old scuff marks from that day, still visible on the table where their chairs had been shoved backward all at once. This time Celeste set down her newly reinstated department badge, and one by one the others did the same, though this time none of them were resigning. Instead, they signed the founding charter of the new Independent Safety Committee, each badge now representing a vote that no administrator would ever again be able to silence. Desmond accepted the role of Chief Medical Officer, but refused to hold unchecked authority over it, insisting that every major decision include input from surgeons, nurses, technicians, and adult patient representatives alike. Jonah brought him the very file Priscilla had once used to condemn him. Now, fully corrected and accompanied by an official statement confirming that he had never committed any professional violation whatsoever. Desmond did not keep the file as some kind of trophy, choosing instead to place it inside the new center's archive, beside the 47-page report that had once been buried, wanting every future physician who walked through those doors to see two things side by side, proof of how easily the truth could be twisted, and proof that it could still triumph when someone was willing to stand and defend it. In the final moments, Desmond prepared to enter another cardiac surgery, and just outside the operating room doors, a younger surgeon asked whether everything that had happened still weighed on him. Desmond looked through the glass at the 11 colleagues already scrubbing in, waiting for him inside, and answered quietly that he had once stood entirely alone before a board of executives, but inside that operating room, no patient had ever been saved by a single pair of hands. Years later, new residents rotating through Harbor Crest would hear the story told in different versions, some emphasizing the 11 surgeons who had risked their careers, others focusing on the 47-page report that had nearly stayed buried forever. But every version ended the same way, with a hospital that had chosen, however reluctantly, to value the truth over its own reputation. Desmond rarely spoke of that period himself, preferring to let his work answer any question people might still carry about who he was. Though on quiet evenings, he sometimes admitted to Celeste that the hardest part had never been the boardroom or the accusations, but the fear that no one else would stand up at all. That fear in the end had been wrong, and it was a mistake he was grateful more than anything else to have made. The doors opened, and Desmond walked through them, joining the very team that had once walked out beside him, a group that had learned in the harshest way possible that they had not been called unqualified, but that they had simply been mistaken by the wrong people for standing alone.